The spring of 1884 arrived the way it always did in the Powder River Basin, slowly, reluctantly, as if the land itself was uncertain whether to trust the warmth. Snow retreated from the lower ground by inches, not miles. Pale green appeared along the creek banks before anywhere else. The cottonwoods took their time. Everything in Wyoming took its time. Clara Whitfield had been awake before the light that morning. She was always awake before the light. She stood at the window for a long moment, looking out at the cabin walls still dark with the last of the night's shadow. The land beyond them stretched flat and enormous toward the mountains which sat against the horizon like something permanent, something that had decided long ago it would not be moved by anything the sky could produce. The mountains did not negotiate with seasons. They simply stood and let the seasons do what seasons did, and they were still there when it was over. She had been thinking about the mountains all winter. Not the mountains themselves, their beauty or their scale, or the particular way they turned colors at dusk, which was the kind of thing you thought about when you had time for it. She had been thinking about what came from behind them, the specific quality of what the northern mountains produced in their worst winters and sent down into the basin below without apology or warning. She had been thinking about that quality with the focused attention of a woman who understood that thinking about a problem was not the same as solving it, but was the necessary step that came before. She went outside. The ground was soft from the last of the snowmelt. She could feel it give slightly beneath her boots as she walked to the small storage shed at the edge of the yard, where she had kept the seeds through the winter in a cloth sack tied at the top with a length of cord. She had ordered them from a catalog the previous autumn more than she thought she would need, which turned out to be exactly the right amount. She carried them back to the cabin and knelt beside the north wall. Not near the wall, against it. She pressed the first seed into the soil no more than 4 inches from the foundation logs, close enough that the wall itself threw a thin line of shadow across her hand. She pressed another beside it, then another. The spacing was deliberate, neither random nor approximate. She had thought about this through the whole of the winter, through the short days and long nights, when the stove worked harder than it should have had to, and she lay awake listening to the cold test the walls and thinking about what Margaret had told her. By the time Eliza appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes with the back of one hand, Clara had already worked her way along half the north face. Eliza was 9 years old and had her father's eyes a particular shade of gray that changed slightly depending on the quality of the light, darker in the morning, clearer by afternoon. She stood in the doorway for a moment in the thin early light, taking in the sight of her mother kneeling against the cabin wall, without comment, the way children sometimes do when they are trying to understand something before they ask about it. She had learned this from Clara, who almost never asked about something she could figure out by watching. Then she went back inside and came out wearing her coat, carrying a second cloth sack of seeds without being asked. Scout, their old brown dog, followed her out and settled in the thin morning shadow along the east wall. He was getting slower now, his muzzle going white at the edges, the joints in his back legs producing a slight hesitation at the top of steps that hadn't been there 2 years ago. But his eyes still tracked everything with the careful attention of an animal that had learned not to dismiss what it didn't understand. He watched Clara work and did not seem troubled by what he saw. Scout had long since learned that Clara's work, however it appeared at the beginning, generally arrived at a purpose by the end. They worked through the morning, moving from the north wall to the east, then to the south. Eliza followed a few feet behind, carrying the seed sack, occasionally pressing one into the earth herself when she found a spot her mother had skipped. She didn't ask questions. Clara didn't offer explanations. The work had a rhythm to it that didn't require words, and both of them had grown accustomed to working in the productive quiet that Clara had established in the years since James. By midday, when the sun had climbed high enough to take some of the chill out of the air, they had finished 3 walls and started on the west. It was Aldous Holt who first saw them. He was coming down from the upper pasture with 2 of his hired men checking the fence line along the creek where the spring thaw had undermined several posts. He noticed Clara on her knees against the cabin wall from a distance, and he slowed his horse without thinking the way a person slows when they see something they can't immediately explain. He watched for a long moment, long enough to confirm that what he was seeing was what he thought he was seeing, a woman pressing seeds into the earth within inches of her cabin's foundation, and then he rode on. He didn't say anything to his men about it, but that evening at the small trading post where men gathered to exchange what the day had produced in the way of news, he mentioned it the way people mention things they expect others to have already seen. Nobody had. By the following week, half the basin had ridden past the Whitfield place on one errand or another, slowing as they passed. What they saw was a widow and her young daughter planting sunflower seeds in a narrow ring around the outside of their cabin, pressed so close to the foundation that anyone with experience of frontier living immediately understood this was not decoration. Decoration didn't press itself against the wood at 4 inches. Decoration didn't follow the full perimeter with that kind of methodical attention, moving from wall to wall, checking the spacing, adjusting, pressing each seed with care rather than scattering them. The way you scattered seeds meant only to be looked at. Whatever this was, it was something else. The conversations began at the trading post and moved outward from there, the way conversations in small communities always do, into the church on Sunday, into the general store on weekday mornings, into the sawmill, where men stood beside stacked lumber waiting for their orders and discussing other people's decisions the way men do when their hands are occupied but their minds are not. The early opinions were mild. A few people assumed Clara was still adjusting to the second spring without James. Grief made people do things. Nobody held it against her. But the mild opinions didn't last long, because every warm day on the frontier carried a price that everyone understood in their bones, not as a philosophy, not as something you said, but as something your body knew from experience. Every hour given to the wrong task was an hour taken from a task that mattered. Roofs needed inspection before summer storms found the weak spots. Kitchen gardens needed to be in the ground by the right week, or the growing season wouldn't be long enough. Firewood needed to be split and stacked while the weather allowed, because trying to cut wood in a November blizzard was a lesson nobody needed to learn twice. Time was not a luxury on the frontier. Time was lumber. Time was food. Time was warmth. And a widow working alone with a 9-year-old and an aging dog in a homestead that needed every hour she could give it was spending that time pressing sunflower seeds against her cabin walls. The conversation at the sawmill turned sharper by the end of the second week. It was Obadiah Crane who sharpened it. Crane ran the basin's winter supply credit, which meant that when the hard months came and families needed provisions they couldn't yet pay for, it was Crane's ledger that held their names and Crane's interest that held their debts. He was not a violent man. He was not, by the measure of the time, even an openly dishonest one. But he was a man who understood leverage the way a carpenter understands wood grain, instinctively, practically, and with complete attention to which direction it would split under pressure. He stood beside the mill's outdoor counter when someone brought up the Whitfield place, and he listened for a moment before he spoke. "That woman's lost her reason along with her husband," he said. It was said without heat, almost pleasantly, which was worse somehow than if he'd said it with contempt. Contempt can be argued with. Pleasantness settles into a room and stays there. A few men laughed. Crane continued. He pointed out, still in that measured and reasonable tone, that there were families in the basin who had survived the previous 3 winters on credit from his store. He pointed out that those families had survived because they had spent the warm months doing the things that needed doing, not planting flowers against walls that needed wood and pitch and attention. He did not say outright that Clara Whitfield was wasting the season. He simply described in careful and considered detail what proper winter preparation looked like. The contrast was left for his audience to draw themselves. People drew it. What Crane did not say, what he would never say, because saying it would require acknowledging it, was the other calculation. The one that lived behind the mild eyes and the reasonable tone. If the technique worked, it changed things. Not just for Clara Whitfield. For everyone. Families who stayed warmer on less fuel needed less from his store. Families who could survive a hard winter on half the coal and firewood they'd needed before were families whose names moved off his ledger and stayed off. His monopoly on winter survival in the Powder River Basin was not maintained by violence or obvious deception. It was maintained by necessity, by the simple fact that people needed what he had. A technique that reduced that need was a threat to everything he had built. The laughter in the sawmill was useful to Crane. It cost him nothing and bought him something he could not purchase any other way, the sense that the basin had already decided what Clara Whitfield was doing, and what it had decided was that she was wrong. He cultivated that sense with care over the following weeks. A word here, a question there. Nothing that could be pointed to. Everything that could be felt. The name came from Crane, though he let it travel through others before it reached public currency. The Flower Widow's Cabin, people began calling it. Then more simply, the Flower Widow's Place. Clara heard it. Everyone heard it. The basin was not large enough for names to stay in one place. She kept planting. It was Harlan Graves who came to her with the real argument. Graves was not a man given to cruelty or to theater. He had built cabins across Wyoming and into Colorado over 25 years, structures that stood against weather, that tested every joint and every decision a builder made. Men brought him problems when the problems were serious, because Graves brought solutions that worked. He was respected the way people respect competence, not because they liked you, but because they'd seen what happened when you were right. He rode out to the Whitfield place on a Tuesday in late May, dismounted at the gate, and walked along the south wall, studying the seedlings that had begun to push up through the earth. Claire was working on the west side, tying a loose fence post back into position. She heard him come around the corner, but didn't stop working. Graves stood for a moment watching the seedlings, then looked at the wall behind them. "You're creating a problem," he said. She continued with the fence post. "Those plants will hold moisture against the logs all summer," he said. "By fall, when you want dry wood, you'll have damp wood. Damp wood rots. Rot becomes repairs you can't afford." He paused. "Then come the mice. Give them enough cover and shelter at the base of your walls, and they'll be inside that cabin before the first snow." It was not said unkindly. That was the thing about Graves. He didn't traffic in unkindness. He trafficked in accuracy, and the accuracy of what he said was part of what made it land with weight. Every word of it was grounded in 25 years of watching cabins fail and understanding why. Clara finished securing the fence post. She straightened up and looked at the seedlings along the west wall for a moment, then looked at Graves. "I know about the moisture," she said. That was all she said. Graves waited. No further explanation came. He looked at the seedlings again. He looked at the wall. He turned the problem over in his mind the way he always turned problems over, looking for the angle where it made sense and couldn't find it. "Wood needs to breathe," he said finally. "I know." Another wait. Another silence. Graves pulled his hat brim down slightly against the afternoon sun and looked across the homestead, the kitchen garden, the small livestock shed, the fence line running toward the creek. Everything about the place was maintained. Not prosperous, but maintained. This was not a woman who failed to think about what she was doing. That more than anything else was what he couldn't reconcile. He rode away without saying anything further. Later at the sawmill, when someone asked him what he'd made of it, he was quiet for a moment before answering. "She's not foolish," he said. "I don't know what she's doing, but she's not foolish." It was less satisfying than what the others wanted to hear. Aldous Holt asked her about it on an afternoon in early June. He had come by to return a post hole digger he'd borrowed in the previous autumn, and he found Clara working along the north wall where the seedlings were tallest, already showing the first suggestion of the height they would reach by midsummer. He handed her the tool, and they talked for a moment about the creek fence and the state of the roads after the spring thaw. Then he looked at the seedlings. "What are the flowers for?" he asked, not unkindly, not with any of Crane's smoothness, just the direct question of a man who wanted a direct answer. Clara pressed another seed into a bare spot in the soil before she looked up. "To protect the cabin," she said. "Nothing else." Aldous looked at the young plants. He looked at the wall behind them. He looked back at Clara. The answer explained less than the question. He picked up his post-hole digger and walked back to his horse and rode toward his own land, turning the words over the way you turn something over when you suspect it means more than it appears to, but can't yet find where the extra meaning lives. What nobody in the basin knew, what Clara had told no one, not even Eliza in any direct way, was where the idea had come from and what it had already survived. She had not invented this. She had received it. The night before her wedding to James Whitfield, his mother had come to where Clara was sitting alone in the kitchen of the Whitfield family's Colorado home. The preparations for the next day finished the house finally quiet. Margaret Whitfield was a woman who had come to America from a village in southern Germany at the age of 19 with her husband and two small children, and who had lived the next 40 years with the particular and undemonstrative toughness of someone who understood that the land did not concern itself with your plans. She sat down across from Clara and worked for a moment with her hands on something she was mending, not looking up, and then she began to talk. Not as a lesson, not as an instruction, just the way someone talks when they are passing something on that they don't want to disappear when they do. She talked about the settlement in Colorado where she and her husband had arrived in the winter of 1863, a community of German-speaking families in the mountains southwest of Denver. She talked about the winter of 1864, which came with a violence that even people who had survived hard winters in the old country were not prepared for. She talked about what they had done before that winter on the advice of the oldest man in the settlement, a former farmer from Bavaria who had seen something similar done with hay and straw in the alpine villages of his childhood. They had wrapped their buildings, not with straw exactly, with sunflower stalks harvested and dried, bound together in tight bundles and pressed against the outer walls from foundation to eave. The principle was simple, though it took years of winters to understand it fully. The stalks, dried and hollow and bound together with countless gaps of trapped air between them, did not conduct cold the way solid material did. Cold moved through mass. Cold moved through contact. Cold was slowed by still air, by the million tiny pockets of nothing that existed between every stem and leaf and seed head of a properly built sunflower wall. The settlement survived 1864 when other settlements that winter did not. Margaret had said all of this without looking up from her mending. Then she set down the mending and looked at Clara directly for the first time since she'd sat down, and she said the thing that Clara had carried with her for 8 years, like a stone in a pocket, small, unassuming, impossible to lose. "The cold hunts walls," she said. "Give it something else to find first." Then she picked up the mending again, and after a while she said something ordinary about the next day's weather, and the conversation was over. Clara had thought about it over the years in the way you think about something you're not yet ready to use. James had been alive then, and James was capable, and James knew how to maintain a cabin through a Wyoming winter, and the knowledge had lived quietly in the back of Clara's mind without urgency. Then James had walked into a whiteout in February of 1880 and not come back. The urgency had arrived that winter. Clara had spent the 3 winters since then doing what she could with what she had, banking snow against the base of the cabin walls, hanging extra blankets over the windows, keeping the fire going through the night while Eliza slept in the warmest corner of the room. Surviving, which was not the same as being safe. She had ordered the seeds in October. None of this was what she told Aldous Holt when he asked. None of this was what she offered Harlan Graves when he came with his warnings. The knowledge was hers, earned through loss and carried through years, and she had learned from Margaret that the best way to hold something real was quietly. Inside the cabin, the coat that had hung behind the door since February of 1880 still hung there. James's coat, dark wool, the collar worn smooth on one side from years of use. Beside the wood stove, his axe rested against the wall where it had leaned for 4 years without being moved. Not because it wasn't needed, because moving it meant deciding something Clara had not yet decided. One evening, while the last light faded beyond the basin and the young sunflower shoots stood small and green along the walls outside, Eliza looked up from where she was sitting near the window. "Would Father have liked the flowers?" she said. The question settled into the room and stayed there. Clara's hands continued working a length of cord she was mending, moving through the familiar motions without pause. After a while, she glanced toward the window, toward the thin line of shoots visible in the failing light. The answer never came, but it didn't need to. The shoots kept reaching upward in the quiet outside, and inside the preparations for winter carried a meaning that went deeper than warmth alone. Old Silas Pruitt came to the Whitfield place on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of June. He was 71 years old and had lived in the Powder River Basin since before most of its current residents had been born. He was not precisely a weather reader in the way the term suggested some kind of mysticism. He was an observer. He had spent 50 years watching the sky and the land and the animals and the patterns they made together, and he had developed an accuracy that was by common agreement better than anything you could buy from a catalog or read in a farmer's almanac. When Silas said something was coming, people set down what they were doing and paid attention. He rode out to the Whitfield place in the long evening light, dismounted at the gate without rushing, and walked around the cabin slowly, hands in his pockets, looking at the seedlings that had now reached 6 inches or more along the north and west walls. He examined the spacing. He crouched at one point and pressed a thumb into the soil near the base of a plant, checking the depth of the roots. He straightened up and looked at the wall behind them for a long time. Then he came around to the south side where Clara was gathering the day's last tools, and he stood for a moment without speaking. "Who taught you that?" he said. Clara looked at the seedlings, then at the distant mountains. "My husband's mother," she said. Silas nodded once. He looked north where the mountains that formed the basin's upper wall had gone slightly dark with the approach of evening, their profiles sharp against the sky that was clear, but carried at its very edges something Silas had been watching for 3 weeks. He had not told anyone what he'd been watching. He had seen it once before, 50 years ago, in the autumn of 1832, on the eastern face of the Bighorn Range. He had been 21 years old, working a trap line with 2 older men who knew the mountains the way Clara Whitfield knew how to press seeds into soil carefully, without wasted motion, with the knowledge that carelessness out here was not a personal failing, but a fatal one. The winter of 1832 had come with a completeness that he still could not fully describe to people who hadn't seen it. Not just cold, not just snow. Something more entire than that, a season that had decided for reasons known only to seasons, to be fully what it was without moderation, without the usual pauses and retreats that allowed people to catch their breath and reassess. Several families in the basin below that trap line had not survived it. He had been watching the same signs gathering for 3 weeks now. The way the geese had begun moving earlier than he'd ever recorded. The ice forming at the lake margins in a pattern he recognized. The particular quality of the northern sky at dawn, which had a flatness that normal autumn skies didn't carry. The elk moving into low country weeks before they should have. He had not said anything to anyone in the basin because knowing a hard winter was coming was not the same as knowing what to do about it, and there was no use creating panic among people who had no good response to the information. But Clara Whitfield had a response. It was growing against her walls right now, 6 inches tall and reaching. He looked at her for a moment in the evening light. "Finish it before October," he said. "All 4 walls. Don't leave gaps." Clara looked at him steadily. She had known old Silas Pruitt since she and James had arrived in the basin 6 years ago, and she had learned, as everyone learned, that when he said something about weather in that particular tone, not dramatic, not alarmed, just certain, you did not ask him to elaborate. "How bad?" she said. Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked north again at the mountains going dark against the sky. "Finish it before October," he said. He walked back to his horse, mounted slowly, the way old men mount horses, and rode back toward his own land without looking back. Clara stood where he had left her for a long time after the sound of his horse had faded. The evening was settling around the cabin, softening the light, bringing out the smell of the warming earth and the faint sweetness of the seedlings along the walls. Scout had come around from the east side and was lying a few feet away, watching her with the calm attention of an animal that was content to wait. Eliza appeared in the doorway. She had James's eyes in the evening light, that particular gray, thoughtful and clear. She looked at her mother standing very still in the yard, and then she looked at the seedlings along the walls, and then she looked back at her mother. "Are we going to be okay?" she said. Clara looked at her daughter for a moment. "Go inside and start supper," she said. "I'll be there in a few minutes." Eliza went back inside. The door closed softly behind her. Clara turned back to the north wall. The seedlings stood in their narrow row against the logs, small and green and alive, lit from the side by the last horizontal light of the day. Behind them, the foundation logs were solid and dark, holding the warmth of the season they'd been built through. She bent down and pressed another seed into a gap she'd noticed near the northeast corner. Then she stood and looked at the mountains going dark against the sky and began calculating how much remained to be done and how many days she had left to do it. Old Silas had told her to finish before October. It was the 22nd of June. She had time, but only if she used every hour of it correctly, the way the frontier required you to use every hour of everything, without waste, without hesitation, without the luxury of explaining herself to people who had already decided what she was doing and what it meant. She pulled her gloves back on. The work had not finished for the day. The sunflowers grew the way things grow in Wyoming, when the season decides to cooperate with a quiet urgency, as if the plants themselves understood that the window of warmth was not a gift, but a loan. And loans in this country came due on a schedule that didn't negotiate. By mid-July, the north and west walls had disappeared behind a curtain of green. Not fully, not yet, but enough that a person riding past the Whitfield place had to look twice to find the logs beneath. The plants reached 3 feet, then 4. Their leaves were broad and dark, overlapping in places, creating a layered density along the base of the walls that was different from what most people had imagined when they'd first seen Clara pressing seeds into the ground in the soft soil of late spring. This was not decoration. Even the people who had said so with the most confidence were beginning to find the word harder to reach for. Clara worked the rows every morning before Eliza was awake, checking the soil, adjusting the ties she'd added to the longer stalks after the first strong wind had taught her the cost of assuming that height brought stability. She had driven stakes along the outer edge of each row and strung a single line of cord between them, not tight enough to constrain the plants, but close enough that they leaned into it slightly when the wind came, sharing the pressure, rather than each one taking it alone. She had learned that from watching them fail. Eliza helped in the afternoons, carrying water from the creek in two small buckets, pouring it at the base of each plant with the careful deliberateness of a child who has been taught that wasted effort is a form of loss. Scout followed her from plant to plant, occasionally nosing at the lower leaves, occasionally stopping to sit and watch the mountains in the west with the expression of an old animal that has developed opinions about the weather. The basin watched from a careful distance. The watching had changed in quality since Harlan Graves had come back from the Whitfield place and said what he'd said at the sawmill, that she wasn't foolish. That single observation had done something subtle to the tone of the conversations, not silenced them. The conversations at the trading post, in the sawmill, in the Sunday churchyard continued, and they still leaned toward skepticism. But skepticism and certainty are different postures, and Graves had, without intending to, shifted the basin from the second toward the first. Obadiah Crane noticed the shift and didn't like it. He continued his work with the steady patience of a man who understands that public opinion is not a river you dam, but a current you redirect. A word at the trading post, a question at the mill, nothing pointed, nothing that left fingerprints. He had built his position in the basin over 20 years by understanding that the most durable influence was the kind that couldn't be traced back to its source, the kind that arrived in someone else's voice and felt like their own conclusion. He was good at this. What he had not anticipated was August. The wind came down from the western ridges on an afternoon in the second week of the month, with the sudden violence that the Wyoming Territory produced without warning and without apology. It swept across the flats in a wall of dust and pressure, taking everything loose with it, loose boards, loose hay, a length of fence wire that Aldous Holt found wrapped around a cottonwood 3 days later, 200 yards from where it had started. At the Whitfield place, the wind found the western row. It hit the plants broadside, and a third of them went down. Not bent down. Stalks snapped at the base or pulled free from the earth, falling against each other in a tangled collapse that left a gap in the western wall's coverage long enough to see the logs clearly for the first time in weeks. Broken stems lay across the dirt at angles that suggested violence. Broad leaves, still green and alive, pressed flat against the ground. Obadiah Crane happened to be on the road that ran past the Whitfield place when the wind eased enough to see the damage. He pulled his horse to a stop. He studied the collapsed western row for a long moment, the gap, the broken stalks, the exposed logs behind them. Then he shook his head in a way that was visible enough to ensure anyone nearby could see it. By evening, the information had moved through the basin with the speed that bad news always traveled, and good news never quite matched. The western row had fallen. The flowers were down. The experiment had reached its natural end. That was the consensus that gathered itself at the trading post that evening, assembling from fragments and half-observations into something solid enough to lean on. A few men were sympathetic. Most were unsurprised. Harlan Graves, who heard the news secondhand at the mill, said nothing and went home early. The following morning, before anyone had ridden out to confirm what they'd heard, Clara Whitfield was already outside. She had been outside since first light. She worked without rushing, which was different from working without urgency. The urgency was there. It was in the set of her shoulders and the efficiency with which she moved from one collapsed plant to the next, in the fact that she had already brought stakes and cord and a small hand trowel from the shed before Eliza had come outside to find her. But rushing and urgency were not the same thing. Rushing was what you did when panic was driving. Urgency was what you did when you understood exactly what was at stake and had decided to meet it without flinching. She lifted each fallen stalk and assessed it. Some were intact, pulled free from the ground, but not broken. These she replanted, firming the soil at the base with her hands, driving a fresh stake beside each one and tying a short length of cord to hold it until the roots re-established themselves. Some were damaged but salvageable, broken partway up the stalk, still alive at the root. She cut the broken sections cleanly and left the lower portion in the ground, trusting that what remained would continue to grow smaller now, but still present. The others, the ones snapped at the base with the roots pulled free, she set aside. Eliza brought replacement seedlings from the kitchen garden, where Clara had planted a secondary row in May as a precaution she hadn't mentioned to anyone. That was the thing about Clara's planting. It existed in layers, the outer ones visible to anyone who looked, the inner ones visible only in moments like this, when a contingency revealed itself and the preparation for it was already in place. Scout spent the morning moving along the base of the western wall, nudging the sheep that had drifted too close during the confusion of the wind, keeping them back from the fragile replanted stems, with a patience that seemed to come from genuine understanding of the situation rather than from habit. By mid-afternoon, the western row stood again. Not identically to what had been there before, some gaps remained, where the damaged plants would take time to fill, and the new stakes and cord gave the row a slightly engineered appearance it hadn't carried before. But it stood, and anyone who looked carefully could see that the way it stood now was different from the way it had stood before the wind. The additional support structure, the cross ties between rows, the secondary planting, filling the spaces where the originals had failed to recover. The wind had knocked the wall down. Clara had built a better wall in its place. It was 2 days after the western row had been restored that she found what the wind had actually revealed. She had been working along the repaired section, checking the ties, when Scout stopped at the northeast corner of the western wall and refused to move. The dog stood with his nose pressed low against the earth, not digging, not agitated, but fixed the way a dog is fixed when it has identified something that doesn't belong to the category of things it expected to find. Clara came to where Scout stood and crouched beside him. She looked at the base of the wall, then she looked more carefully. Then she stood and began working her hands slowly along the junction between the sunflower row and the cabin logs, feeling rather than looking, moving her fingers into the spaces between the dried lower leaves and the wood behind them. Her hand stopped. She had found it in a section she hadn't replanted, a section that had survived the wind intact, that looked from the outside exactly as it had looked all summer, dense and close planted and solid. But behind the outer surface of leaves and stems, her hands had found a void, a space nearly 2 feet long running between the sunflower layer and the cabin logs, not a gap in the planting, but a channel in the interior of the layer itself, a tunnel of moving air where there should have been packed stillness. She understood immediately what it meant. The goal of the sunflower wall was to break the cold before it reached the logs, to force it through thousands of small obstacles, so that it arrived at the wood stripped of its momentum, weakened, unable to carry its full force into the cabin. But a channel, a clear passage where air could move freely, building speed rather than losing it, would do something worse than conducting cold. It would concentrate it. She had been so careful about the outside. The inside had hidden something she hadn't seen. She began taking the section apart. Hours of work came down in an afternoon. Bundles she had tied in place weeks earlier were cut loose. Stems she had woven into a dense layer with deliberate care were pulled free and set aside. By the time the light began to fail, she had exposed a full 6-foot section of logs and was looking at the interior structure of what she'd built with the critical attention of someone who has been shown that their work contains a flaw they had not imagined. Eliza watched from a few feet away, holding the armful of replacement material her mother had asked her to carry. "It looks exactly the same," Eliza said, looking at the section Clara had torn down and the section on either side that still stood. Clara was already beginning to rebuild. She set the first bundle in place with her hands pressing it close against the log, making sure there was contact rather than space. "The wind will know the difference," she said. She rebuilt it from the frame outward, pressing each bundle tight against the log before adding the next, filling the space completely rather than layering from the outside in. When she was finished, there was no channel. There was no void. There was only packed material and trapped air in the configuration that Margaret had described, and that Clara now understood not as an idea, but as a physical reality she had built with her own hands. She stepped back and looked at it. Then she noticed what she had not noticed while the work was coming apart. On 2 of the lower stakes, she had removed the cord was not frayed. It was cut. The difference was unmistakable to anyone who had spent a working life handling cord. A frayed end separates over time, with the fibers pulling apart at different lengths. A cut end was clean. Both ends were clean at the same height, at the same angle. She crouched at the base of the rebuilt section and looked at the soil that had been sheltered from the wind and rain beneath the outer layer of the wall. In the protected earth, undisturbed by weather, she found a boot print. Not hers, not Eliza's. A man's boot larger than anything on the Whitfield place, pressed into the sheltered earth at a point where no reason existed to stand unless you were working on the wall itself. Clara crouched at the boot print for a long moment. She thought about the western row which had gone down in the wind in ways that looked on reflection worse than the wind alone should have produced. She thought about the specific section that had collapsed most completely, which had also been the section furthest from the cabin, most sheltered from the road by the shed, least visible to anyone passing by. She thought about Obadiah Crane sitting on his horse in the road afterward, shaking his head in a way designed to be seen. She stood up. She did not go to the town constable, who was a friend of Crane's and had borrowed money from him twice. She did not mention it to Aldous Holt or to Harlan Graves or to anyone who might ask questions she didn't want answered in public. She did not confront Crane directly, which would have required proof she couldn't produce and a public dispute she couldn't afford. Instead, she rebuilt the section she had torn down this time, packing it so tightly against the logs that no cord could have been cut and no void could have formed without dismantling the entire structure from the outside in. She doubled the depth of the layer at the base. She added a second line of stakes on the interior side, making the whole assembly a system of interlocking parts rather than a single layer that could be compromised at one point. Then she walked to the shed and came back with a length of chain and a padlock she'd had in a wooden box since before James died, and she locked the gate. The next morning, she extended the double-depth approach across the entire north wall and began considering the east. The person who had wanted the wall to fail had made it stronger than it would otherwise have been. She was aware of the irony. She filed it away without comment and kept working. The mice arrived in early October, exactly as Harlan Graves had predicted they would. Eliza noticed them first movement at the base of the northwest section, small and quick, the particular kind of movement that a practiced eye on a frontier homestead recognizes before it fully registers as a thought. She called her mother without alarm, the matter-of-fact tone of a child raised in a place where mice were not a crisis but a problem, and problems were met practically. Clara examined the section. They had found a gap. She had not fully closed a space near the foundation where the bottom course of dried stalks sat slightly proud of the soil, leaving a passage just large enough for a mouse to decide it was an invitation. Two or three had already begun to nest in the interior of the wall, pulling dried material inward to create a compact sheltered space that was, from the mouse's perspective, an ideal winter residence. She pulled the compromised section apart, found the nests, removed them, and examined the void they had occupied. Then she gathered bundles of dried sage and sweet grass from the slope behind the cabin plants she had noted over the summer and set aside in her mind as useful, though she hadn't known until now exactly for what. She packed them into the base of the rebuilt section and along the foundation line on the western and northern sides where the soil met the wall at an angle that mice preferred. Within a week, the signs of nesting had become difficult to find. Within 2 weeks, they were gone entirely. The repair added 3 days of work she hadn't planned for. It also taught her something about the base of the structure that she hadn't fully understood before, that the junction between the wall and the ground was the most vulnerable point in the whole system, the place where anything small and persistent and motivated could find its way through if she didn't close that meeting completely. She closed it. It was in the third week of September that Harlan Graves came back. He came on a Wednesday afternoon when Claire was working on the east wall, building the final sections of the dried stalk layer that would eventually replace the living plants as the season pulled the green out of them and left behind the brown hollow insulating material she had been growing toward all summer. The sunflowers had matured by then, their heads heavy and lowered with ripe seed, their leaves gone crisp at the edges, their stalks beginning to take on the woody stiffness of late season. She had already begun harvesting. Part of the seed crop she'd collected into cloth sacks for the following spring. The rest remained attached, woven into the wall itself, where the broad seed heads would fill the gaps between stalks, the way stones fill the gaps in a fieldstone wall, not decorative, structural. Every piece of the plant had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. Graves came around the corner of the cabin and stood watching her work. He watched for several minutes without speaking. Clara was aware of him, but didn't stop. She had learned over a season of this that explaining herself to people who were watching was less productive than letting them watch. "How thick are you planning to make it?" he asked finally. 30 inches, Clara said. "Maybe 36 on the north side." Graves was quiet. He was looking at the section she'd already completed on the west wall, the rebuilt section denser and more carefully constructed than what had stood there before. He was looking at it the way he looked at joinery or at a framing decision, with the attention of a man who builds things and therefore cannot help reading the structures other people build. "You're not building a wall," he said slowly. "You're building an air trap." Clara glanced at him. "Yes," she said. It was the first time she had confirmed anything directly to anyone in the basin. She returned to her work immediately, but the word had been said, and Graves took it the way a man takes a measurement he has been trying to estimate and is finally handed directly with the particular stillness of someone recalibrating. He stayed for a while longer, not speaking, just watching. Then before he left, he asked a question she had not expected. "The section on the northeast corner," he said, "the one that's thicker than the rest. You built that after the wind." "After the wind," Clara said. Graves looked at the corner in question. He could see now that he knew what to look for, that the northeast section had been constructed differently, more deliberately, with a kind of internal logic that the other sections had approached but not quite matched. "What changed?" he said. Clara tied the cord she'd been working on and moved to the next stake. "I found a problem," she said. "I fixed it." Graves stood with his hands in his pockets, looking at the northeast corner for a long moment. Then he walked back to his horse. But he didn't ride away immediately. He stood at his horse for a minute, and Clara, watching from the corner of her eye, without appearing to, saw him pull a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and make a note on it with the small pencil he always carried. He had been drawing it. He had been coming out here and watching the wall go up week by week, and he had been drawing what he saw: the spacing, the angles, the depth at different sections. Taking measurements with his eyes, the way carpenters took measurements with their hands. Building a record of something he hadn't been willing to admit, even to himself, that he was studying. He rode away without looking back. Clara watched him go. Then she turned back to the east wall. Graves returned at the end of October. He came without announcement, tied his horse at the gate, and walked the full perimeter of the cabin, slowly examining the finished wall, the way he had examined structures all his professional life, with his hands as much as his eyes pressing at intervals to test the resistance and density of what he found. Clara watched him from the doorway without going out. He came around to the front of the cabin after 15 minutes and looked at her. "I was wrong about the rot," he said. "The layer breathes. The moisture moves outward, not inward." He paused. "I was right about the mice. But you solved it." Clara said nothing. "The air pockets," he said. It wasn't a question. It was something being said aloud that had been worked through internally and was now arriving at certainty. "Still air doesn't conduct," Clara said. "Moving air does. Every gap in there holds air that isn't moving." Graves nodded slowly. He pulled the folded paper from his coat pocket and looked at it, then at the wall, then back at it. He made another note. Then he looked at her. "The east section near the corner," he said. "I'd have approached it differently. The bundle orientation runs vertical. Horizontal would be more resistant to lateral wind pressure." He paused. "I think." Clara looked at the east corner. She considered it. "Show me," she said. They worked together for 2 hours on the east section, removing several courses and rebuilding them, with the bundles running horizontal rather than vertical, weaving them in alternating directions, the way a basket weaver alternates the grain for strength. Clara had not thought of it this way. Graves had not thought of most of what surrounded the rest of the cabin. The two approaches produced something neither had designed alone. When they finished, Graves stepped back and looked at the corner. "Better," he said. Clara looked at it. "Yes," she said. He picked up his coat from the fence post where he'd set it. He started for his horse, then stopped and turned back. "I'd like to copy the notes I've been keeping," he said. "For others, if this works." Clara looked at him for a moment, in the late afternoon light, the shadows from the finished wall falling long across the yard. "When it works," she said. Graves almost smiled. He nodded once and walked to his horse. November arrived with cold mornings and the smell of something harder following behind them, the particular atmospheric quality of deep winter gathering itself just out of sight, like pressure building behind a door. The color left the basin quickly. Gray replaced it. The mountains to the north took on a weight in the sky that they didn't carry in other seasons. Obadiah Crane made one final pass along the road in front of the Whitfield place on a Thursday in the second week of November, when the wall was fully complete and the cabin had all but disappeared behind it. He pulled his horse to a stop. He looked at the structure for a long time. The finished wall had a presence that was different from what he'd expected, from what anyone had expected. It did not look like a folly or a desperate improvisation. It looked in its own strange way like something considered, something built rather than scattered. He looked at it with the expression of a man whose narrative requires the story to end one way and who is standing in front of evidence that it might end another. Then he turned to the man riding beside him and said loudly enough to carry, "Biggest haystack in Wyoming." The man beside him laughed. Crane rode on. But Clara, who was working near the north wall and had heard it, noted the pause that had come before the joke. The pause had lasted longer than confidence requires. Old Silas Pruitt came by at the end of November and walked the perimeter without speaking for so long that Eliza began to worry he had forgotten why he'd come. He stopped at the north wall and pressed his open palm against the outermost layer of stalks, feeling the density and the give of it. Then he turned and looked at the mountains. "You finished before October," he said. "Middle of October," Clara said. Silas nodded. He turned his eyes north again. The mountains had gone gray-white, their profiles softened by distant snow that hadn't arrived in the basin yet, but was building its mass above the ridgeline with the deliberate patience of something that had all winter to spend. "It's coming soon," he said. Clara followed his gaze. She had been watching the mountains too every morning, recording temperatures in the small ledger she kept beside the thermometer on the wall opposite the stove. The numbers had been falling in a pattern that she was beginning to understand. "How soon?" she said. Old Silas looked at the sky for a long moment. "Keep your wood close to the door," he said. He walked back to his horse, mounted slowly, rode north. Clara watched him go. Then she turned and looked at the north wall of her cabin, the wall she had spent 7 months building, that had been knocked down and rebuilt and sabotaged and repaired and improved until it was something different from what she had first imagined. Denser, more deliberate, truer in its construction than the original plan could have produced. She went inside and moved the woodpile closer to the door. It was a small action, practical, unremarkable to anyone watching. But in the Powder River Basin in the autumn of 1884, the small practical actions were the ones that would be tallied in December when tallying was the only thing left to do. Clara had been tallying all year. The wall was finished. The wood was close to the door. The mountains to the north had gone white to their midline and were not coming back. She was as ready as 7 months of careful work could make her. Whether that was ready enough was a question only one thing in the world was qualified to answer, and it was already on its way. The 9th of December came in with the gray pre-dawn silence that preceded the basin's worst mornings. No wind yet, no snow, just a stillness so complete it had weight. The kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful. The kind that was simply the absence of what was about to arrive. Clara had been awake since 4. She stood at the north window looking out at the mountains. They were gone, not obscured by cloud in the ordinary way where the profile disappears behind a gray mass, and you know the profile is still there behind it. Gone in the way things go when what stands in front of them is total. The entire northern horizon had been replaced by a single uniform darkness that sat lower than any weather system she had watched arrive in 6 years in this basin. Scout was standing at the door, not scratching, not whining, standing with a stillness that Clara had learned over the years to read as more serious than agitation. Agitation meant something immediate. This stillness meant something coming. She let him in. By 7 in the morning, the temperature had dropped 11 degrees from where it had stood at dawn. By 9, it had dropped another 18. Clara recorded both readings in the ledger on the wall, pressing the pencil carefully into the paper, noting the time beside each entry with the same precision she had maintained since October. The numbers told a story she could already feel in the air around her, but the numbers would outlast the feeling, and she had learned the value of what outlasted. Eliza ate her breakfast without being told twice. She had her father's particular quality of composure in the face of things. She didn't fully understand the ability to be calm, not because she was unaware, but because she had decided that calm was the most useful thing available. "Is it coming today?" she said. "Yes," Clara said. Eliza looked at the window. The light had changed in the hours since breakfast had started, gone from pale to something grayer and more uniform, the shadows flattening out as the source of light above the clouds became too diffuse to cast them. "Should I bring in more wood?" she said. "Yes," Clara said. "All of it." By 10 o'clock, the wind had arrived. It did not build gradually. It came as a wall, a physical presence that struck the cabin with a concussive force that rattled the window frames and drove through every external gap at once. Eliza, who had been making her third trip between the woodpile and the door, felt it hit her from the north with enough force to stop her mid-step and require her to lean into it to continue walking. She made 2 more trips after that, each one harder than the one before, and then Clara told her to stay inside, and the door was barred. The sound was what Clara had not fully prepared for. She had prepared for the cold. She had prepared for the length of it, laying in provisions for a week without assuming the storm would end before then. She had prepared for the isolation the way a storm of this size closed every road, and severed every connection between homesteads as completely as if the distances between them had tripled overnight. She had not prepared for the sound because you could not prepare for the sound. It was not wind the way wind normally presented itself, not a roaring or a howling, those words that people used and that carried some of the truth, but not all of it. It was more total than that. It was the sound of a force that had decided to be everywhere at once, pressing against every surface of the cabin, simultaneously finding every imperfection in every board and joint and seal, and testing it with a persistence that did not tire and did not relent. The stove burned. Clara fed it at regular intervals, not frantically measured amounts, at measured times, maintaining a steady output, rather than chasing warmth in surges. She had recorded the stove's consumption patterns in the ledger through October, and November had learned its behavior well enough to manage it the way you manage something you have studied, with the confidence of accumulated observation rather than the anxiety of guesswork. She checked the thermometer on the wall at 10 o'clock. 48 degrees. By noon it had climbed to 54. She fed the stove its noon measure of wood and recorded the temperature and sat down at the table across from Eliza, who was reading by the lamp. Scout had not moved from his position near the stove. One ear was folded across his face. Outside, the wind spent itself against the outer surface of the sunflower wall, and found in that expenditure something it had not found at other cabins in the basin. Not a barrier, not a solid surface to strike and rebound from, but a maze. Thousands of stems and leaves and seed heads and gaps of trapped, still air, each one deflecting a small portion of the wind's energy sideways. Each pocket of stillness resisting the cold's passage in the way that still things resist, moving things not by opposing force with force, but by refusing to move at all. Large currents became smaller currents. Small currents collided with each other and scattered. By the time the air reached the logs beneath, it was diminished, not stopped. Nothing stopped the wind, but diminished, stripped of the momentum it had carried across hundreds of miles of open country and brought down from the northern ridge with the full intention of spending it on whatever stood in its path. The logs held their warmth. The thermometer read 58 degrees at 2 in the afternoon, 59 at 4. At 7, when the wind outside had built to a pitch that had rattled the window frames continuously for 9 hours, it read 61 degrees, and Claire added wood to the stove at the normal interval and recorded the number in the ledger and set the pencil down. Eliza looked up from her book. "Is it warmer than last night?" she said. "Yes," Clara said. Eliza considered this information for a moment, then looked back at her book. Clara looked at the north wall of the cabin, the interior surface solid and close and holding. She could hear through the logs and through the thick layer of stalks and stems and packed air on the other side, the sound of the storm spinning itself against what she had built. It was not a quiet sound, but it was a distant one. 300 yards across the frozen ground that separated the Whitfield place from the Holt homestead, Aldous Holt was feeding his stove for the third time in 2 hours. He had started the storm with what he considered an adequate wood supply. What he'd needed in any of the previous 4 winters, measured carefully and stacked close enough to the door to reach without going fully outside. By midnight of the first night, he understood that his measurement had been calibrated to a different kind of winter than the one that had arrived. The cold came through the north wall in a way he had not experienced before. Not as a chill, not as the ordinary seepage that any cabin on the frontier produced on cold nights and that a working stove corrected without drama. It came as a presence, a directional force. He could feel it from across the room, a gradient in the air between the north wall and the south wall that the stove was addressing but not solving. He checked his thermometer at midnight, 43 degrees. At 2 in the morning, 41. He fed the stove again. His youngest son, 8 years old, had migrated in his sleep from his own bunk to the floor nearest the stove, burrowing under 2 extra blankets with the instinctive thermal intelligence of a child who is cold and will not be argued with about it. Aldous covered him with a 3rd blanket and stood looking at the north wall. He could see frost, not on the window that was expected. On the interior log surface of the north wall, a thin white tracery had appeared at the chinking lines where the dried moss and clay that filled the gaps between the logs had contracted slightly in the cold and allowed air to find its way through. The frost grew slowly, spreading outward from each gap in a delicate pattern that would have been beautiful in another context. In this context, it told him exactly how well his wall was doing its job. He went back to the woodpile and calculated what remained against what the night still held. The numbers did not comfort him. The storm continued through the 10th without weakening. If anything, the second day was harder than the first, the wind maintaining its velocity with a consistency that wore on structures and on people alike, finding the fatigue in every joint and seal, and settled chinking line that the first day's assault had begun. A livestock shed 2 miles north of the Holt place lost its east wall sometime during the second afternoon. The owner heard it go a crack, followed by a sustained tearing sound, and could do nothing but wait. At the Whitfield place, the second day passed at a pace that had nothing urgent in it. Clara worked on mending in the afternoon, a practical task she had saved for days when weather prevented outdoor work. Eliza finished her book and began another. Scout ate his evening meal with the unhurried manner of an animal that has assessed the situation and found it satisfactory. The thermometer on the wall varied between 59 and 62 degrees through the course of the second day, never departing significantly from the range it had established on the first. The stove consumed what it normally consumed. Clara recorded every reading. On the morning of the 11th, the sound changed. It happened gradually, a loosening in the quality of the wind, a reduction in the flatness of the sky, that appeared first at the southern edge of the basin and worked its way north over the course of 3 hours. By mid-morning, the mountains had begun to reappear, their profiles emerging from the gray, the way objects emerge when your eyes adjust to a change in light first, as suggestions, then as shapes, then as the solid and specific things they had always been. The storm was done. Clara opened the cabin door. The cold entered immediately and completely the way cold enters when there is nothing between it and you, and for a moment she simply stood in the doorway and felt it the full, unmediated temperature of a Wyoming morning after a 2-day blizzard. It was severe. She did not minimize that. It was the kind of cold that explained why people died in Wyoming winters, and always would. Then she stepped outside and looked at the north wall. The outer surface of the sunflower wall had been rearranged by the storm. Some stalks had been stripped away from the uppermost sections. A portion near the northeast corner had been compressed and flattened by the sustained pressure of 2 days of 70-mile-an-hour wind. Here and there, loose material hung frozen in the positions the wind had left it ice-locked into shapes that would hold until the thaw. The inner layer was intact. Every bundle she had pressed against the logs remained in place. The sections she had rebuilt after finding the void, the ones she had doubled in depth after the evidence of deliberate sabotage, were undisturbed. The horizontal bundling that Harlan Graves had shown her on the east corner had performed exactly as he had estimated it would, distributing the lateral pressure across the full width of the section, rather than concentrating it at the ties. What had been lost in the outer surface had served a purpose. It had taken the storm's highest force and spent it on material that could be replaced in spring. What lay behind it had not been reached. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney into the still cold air of the post-storm morning. It was not the heavy smoke of a stove fighting. It was the ordinary smoke of a fire doing what fires do in the morning. She was standing at the north wall examining the compressed section near the corner when she heard the sound of boots breaking through the frozen surface crust of the snow. The particular crunch of someone walking through what a blizzard leaves behind. Laboring slightly, the footsteps of a person who had traveled some distance through difficult conditions. She turned. Aldous Holt was crossing the field. He was moving with the careful, effortful pace of a man who had spent a night and a day burning more wood than he had and sleeping less than he should, whose body carried the particular exhaustion of sustained cold. Not the clean tiredness of hard work, but the draining tiredness of sustained defense. His coat was heavy with the moisture of the journey. His face, when he came close enough for Clara to read it, had the drawn quality of someone who has been holding something back for a while. He stopped at the edge of the cleared path near the north wall and looked at the cabin. He looked at the outer surface of the wall, damaged and rearranged by the storm. He looked at the chimney with its quiet, ordinary smoke. He looked at the doorway open now, through which warm air moved in a visible shimmer against the frozen air outside. He did not speak for a long time. Clara waited. He had come all this way through the post-blizzard conditions, which were not easy, and she understood that the journey meant something more than concern for her welfare. A man who had simply wanted to check on his neighbor could have waited for the roads to clear. Aldous Holt had come before the roads were anything breaking his own path across the field in the raw cold of the morning after. He came for a reason. She let him arrive at it. "How much wood did you use?" he said finally. Clara told him the number. She had it precisely because she had recorded every addition to the stove in the ledger from the start of the storm to the end. Aldous absorbed the number without visible reaction, But something shifted in his expression, a recalculation happening somewhere behind the surface. "We used twice that," he said. "Almost exactly." He looked at the thermometer visible through the open doorway. 60 degrees, the morning temperature, the stove not yet at its daytime pace. He looked at his own hands for a moment, the hands that had split and carried and fed wood through 2 nights of sustained work to hold his cabin at temperatures that the Whitfield place had exceeded without effort. Clara stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside," she said. He came in. The warmth met him at the threshold. Not an aggressive warmth, not the close, suffocating heat of a stove pushed beyond its reasonable range, but a steady ambient warmth that the room had been holding for 2 days without interruption. The kind of warmth that belongs to a room rather than to the appliance heating it. Scout lifted his head briefly, then settled it back down on his paws. Eliza looked up from the table where she was eating her breakfast, assessed the visitor with the clear-eyed economy of a 9-year-old, and returned to her meal. Aldous stood just inside the door and looked at the thermometer on the far wall. Then he looked at the stove, which was not roaring. Then he looked at the wood stacked along the wall, which was not depleted. He turned slowly and looked at the interior surface of the north wall, the inside face of the logs that formed the north side of the cabin. He crossed the room and stood before it. He pressed his palm flat against the wood. He held it there. Clara watched him. The logs were warm, not hot, not the conducted heat of a stove too close, not the surface warmth of wood that has been directly heated. They were warm the way things are warm when they have held their own temperature against something that tried to take it from them. The wood had retained what the winter had come to claim, and it had done it because 40 inches of sunflower stalks and still air and dried sage and patient, deliberate construction stood on the other side of it. Aldous lowered his hand slowly. He turned and looked at Clara, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man arriving at the end of an argument he had been conducting internally for 7 months and finding that the conclusion was not the one he had anticipated. "I was wrong," he said. The words were quiet. They didn't need volume. The room already knew. Clara went to the table and picked up the ledger. She crossed the room and held it out to him. Not as a demonstration, not as a rebuke. He had asked with his presence and his question about the wood, and she was answering in the only language that had ever mattered in this conversation, the language of recorded fact. He took it. He opened it at the beginning and read forward. The entries were simple and regular date-time temperature, morning and evening wood consumption notes on conditions. Week after week, starting in October, building a record that was not dramatic and not rhetorical. Just numbers. Just the patient accumulation of what had actually happened set down in Clara's careful hand on the pages of a worn leather book. He reached the pages from the blizzard. He read the temperatures recorded through the 9th and 10th, the consistent range between 59 and 62, the stove consumption steady and unremarkable, the notes brief and observational. Outside wind sustained visibility nil, inside normal. Then he reached the final entry from the night of the 9th, the worst night of the storm, the night his own cabin had dropped to 41 degrees, while his youngest son slept under 3 blankets on the floor beside the stove. The entry was dated December 9th, 1884. The temperature was noted, the wood consumption was recorded. And then below the line where those things were written in handwriting that was different from the rest, not the careful recording hand, but something more personal written without the straight horizontal pressure of documentation, were 11 words. "James," the wall held. "Our daughter is warm." Aldous Holt read the line once. Then he read it again. He stood with the ledger open in his hands for a long time without speaking. He was a man who had buried a wife and built a homestead from bare ground and raised 2 sons alone and survived more Wyoming winters than he could count, and he understood what he was holding. Not a weather record, not a technical document, not evidence in an argument. A letter. Written to a man 4 years dead on the worst night of the worst storm the basin had seen in living memory by a woman who had spent 7 months building the thing she had promised herself. She would build the thing that would keep their daughter warm in the kind of winter that had taken him, and who had sat down in the warmth of what she had built and written to him because there was no one else in the world she wanted to tell. Aldous closed the ledger carefully. He set it on the table with the same deliberateness with which Clara had offered it, without ceremony, without drama, just the physical fact of the book returning to its place. He looked at Eliza, who was watching him now, with those gray eyes that Clara saw James in every time the light changed. He looked at Clara. He didn't say anything more. There was nothing more to say. The blizzard had said everything that needed saying, and the ledger had confirmed it, and the 11 words at the bottom of the last page had explained what all of it meant in a way that no argument could have reached. He walked to the door, stopped. "I'll send my son over with wood this afternoon," he said. "You should have a full stack before it gets cold again tonight." Clara said, "That's not necessary." "I know it's not," Aldous said. He opened the door and went back out into the cold. Clara stood at the window and watched him cross the field, breaking his path back through the frozen crust, moving with the same careful effort as before. She watched him until he was small in the distance, and then gone. Then she looked at the mountains, which were fully visible now for the first time in 2 days, clear and specific and permanent, against a sky that had returned to its ordinary blue. Eliza came to stand beside her. They stood together at the window for a moment without speaking. "Is he going to plant sunflowers?" Eliza said. Clara looked at the mountains. "Eventually," she said. Obadiah Crane came by the Whitfield place once in January, a week after the roads had cleared enough to ride. He did not stop. He slowed his horse at the section of road that passed closest to the north wall. The wall still standing, its outer surface marked by the storm, but its structure intact, the chimney above it threading a line of smoke into the cold afternoon air, and he looked at it for a long moment from the saddle. He looked at it the way a man looks at evidence he has spent considerable effort trying to prevent from existing. Then he rode on without stopping. He never asked about the wood consumption figures. He never asked about the thermometer readings. He never mentioned the blizzard of December 1884 to anyone in the basin for the rest of his life. He was a man who understood evidence, which was precisely why he needed to never discuss this particular set of it. Old Silas Pruitt rode past the Whitfield place in late December, 2 weeks after the blizzard had released the basin. He did not stop either. He rode the perimeter of the property, slowly looking at the wall from the saddle. The damaged outer surface, the intact inner layer, the thin, steady line of smoke from the chimney that told him everything the wall's condition had already suggested. He looked at it for a long time in the pale winter light, this structure that a woman had built across 7 months, while the basin laughed at it, that had stood against the worst night he'd seen in 50 years in this country. He looked north then toward the mountains that had produced the storm he had spent a lifetime learning to read. He nodded once to no one in particular. He did not mention it to anyone. He didn't need to. The wall was still standing. That was the only conversation that had ever mattered. Harlan Graves spent the winter working on his notes. He spread his drawings and measurements across the workbench in his shop on the evenings when there was nothing else to do, which were many, and he organized what he had observed over 7 months of watching Clara build into something he could describe to another person. Not a manual, he was not the kind of man who wrote manuals. A set of principles. The spacing that worked and the spacing that didn't. The bundle orientation that resisted lateral wind pressure. The depth requirements for different exposures. The material at the base that solved the mouse problem without solving it every winter again. He brought the notes to the mill in March and laid them on the counter and left them there without comment. By the time planting season arrived, 3 men had asked him questions about what was on those pages. He answered them accurately and without embellishment. Aldous Holt planted sunflowers against the walls of his cabin in May of 1885. He did it in the early morning before his sons were up working along the north wall. First, the way Clara had worked, pressed close to the foundation, spaced deliberately following the perimeter, with the attention of someone who understands that the work matters and is therefore not rushed. His younger son came out while he was working on the west wall and watched him for a while without speaking. "What are you planting?" the boy said finally. "Sunflowers," Aldous said. The boy looked at the wall. "Why against the wall?" Aldous pressed the next seed into the soil. He thought about the ledger. He thought about 11 words. He thought about his palm against warm wood on the morning after a storm that had brought his own cabin to 41 degrees. "They protect it," he said. The boy accepted this without further question and went back inside. By the summer of 1886, the flower wall had become a feature of the landscape in ways that no longer required explanation. Riders passed homesteads where sunflowers stood against cabin walls and noted it the way you note things that belong where they are, without particular comment, as part of the established vocabulary of the place. Children who were 6 and 7 years old in 1885 grew up in the basin assuming that cabins had always been built this way. They would carry that assumption into their adult lives, into their own homesteads, into the instructions they would one day give their own children without necessarily knowing where the instructions had come from. The knowledge outlived the argument. It outlived the mockery, which faded the way mockery fades when the thing being mocked stops being questionable and become simply true. It outlived the specific memory of the blizzard of December 1884, which became a story told at the trading post, and then a reference point, and then a fixed star in the basin's history that people navigated by without always remembering why it was placed where it was. Clara continued her ledger. She recorded temperatures through the winter of 1885, which was hard but not historic, and through the winter of 1886, which was moderate by Wyoming standards. She recorded the performance of the wall as it was replenished each autumn with fresh stalks and adjusted where the previous winter had compressed the older material. She recorded the small improvements she made each season, a refinement in the base treatment, a change in the way she tied the upper bundles to account for ice accumulation. The ledger grew. On the wall near the door, James's coat remained on its peg. The axe rested beside the wood stove where it had rested for years. These things were not monuments or memorials. They were simply objects that belonged in the room that had found their place and kept it the way things keep their place when the people who share the space with them have decided that moving them would require a decision that wasn't necessary. Eliza grew. She was 13 by the winter of 1887 then, 14 acquiring the particular self-possession of a girl raised in a place that required self-possession. She had her father's eyes and her mother's hands, the same capable, unhurried hands that pressed seeds into the earth each spring and tied cord between stakes with the particular efficiency of someone who has done a thing enough times to know exactly how much effort it requires. The mountains stood against the horizon the way they always stood. Scout's steps slowed further through the seasons following the great blizzard. He moved through the yard with the deliberateness of an animal that has learned that deliberateness serves better than speed. Spending his afternoons in the thin winter light at the window on the south side of the cabin, lying with his head on his paws, looking out at the yard and the south wall and the landscape beyond it with the settled expression of an animal that is in the right place and knows it. He had done his work. The nose that had found the hidden void in the north wall, the patience that had kept the sheep from the fragile plants, the quiet companionship that had moved from wall to wall through all the long months of building. All of it had served its purpose, and the purpose had been met. And what remained now was the slower business of days that didn't require anything urgent from him. One afternoon in the autumn of 1887, on a day that had the particular thin quality of late October light, Scout walked to his window and lay down in his usual spot and did not get up again. Eliza found him there in the late afternoon when the light had gone low and gold across the floor. She sat with him for a while in the quiet of the room, her hand resting on his side, feeling the stillness that had replaced what had been there before. Outside the south wall stood in the last of the light the dried stalks of the current season's planting pressed against the logs in their familiar rows. Clara came in and stood in the doorway and looked at her daughter sitting beside the old dog in the amber light and did not say anything for a while. Then she crossed the room and sat beside Eliza, and the two of them stayed there together as the light changed and faded and the room grew dim around them. Not speaking, not needing to. The way they had worked together in the early mornings of 1884, carrying seeds from wall to wall, the work creating its own language between them that didn't require words. Outside, the wind moved through the basin in the ordinary way of autumn wind, not with the violence of what was coming, not with the full intention it would carry in another month or two, but with the early suggestion of it. A reminder issued by the season that winter was still out there beyond the mountains, gathering itself for whatever it had decided to be this year. The walls of the cabin held the warmth of the day against it. They had learned to do that. They would keep doing it. Eliza grew into adulthood and kept her mother's ledger habit, starting her own in a fresh leather book the year she was old enough to manage the homestead through a season on her own. She recorded temperatures and wood consumption and the performance of the walls each winter, noting improvements the way Clara had noted them, without drama in the plain language of observation. She taught her own children to press the seeds close to the foundation in the early spring, explaining the spacing and the depth with the same absence of ceremony that Margaret had used in a Colorado kitchen decades before. The knowledge moved forward. In the Powder River Basin in the years after Clara Whitfield had pressed the first seed against the logs of her cabin in the spring of 1884, more and more walls learned to answer the winter's question. More and more children grew up never knowing a time when cabins had stood without their sunflower skins, assuming without question that this was simply how things were done and had always been done. They were right in the way that people are right when they inherit something true without knowing its origin. The truth doesn't require its history to keep functioning. It requires only that it be passed on. The wind still came every winter. It still came down from the northern ridge with everything the sky above it had assembled, still struck every structure in its path with the same indifferent force it had always applied. It still searched for walls the way it had always searched for walls, looking for the weakness that would let it in. What it found in the Powder River Basin in the years that followed was different from what it had found before. It found walls that had been taught not by any single lesson, not by any easy understanding, but by 7 months of careful work in failure and repair and improvement, by a woman who had received a piece of knowledge and held it through years of loss and then used it without asking permission from anyone. The cold hunts walls. Give it something else to find first. James Whitfield's coat stayed on its peg behind the door for many years. The axe stayed beside the stove. Neither was moved by sentiment or by ceremony. They stayed because the room they were in was a room that understood the value of things that had found their proper place and kept it. Outside every spring, a 9-year-old girl's work lived on in the walls of cabins across the basin, in the seeds pressed close to the foundation, in the careful spacing in the stalks that rose through summer and dried through autumn, and stood through winter doing the thing they had been grown to do. Not stopping the cold. Nothing stopped the cold, but giving it something else to find first. And somewhere beyond every horizon another winter was always waiting. Patient, certain, arriving without announcement on mornings that looked like ordinary mornings until they didn't. When it came, the walls were ready.